Some sounds do not fade with time, some screams cut through stone, and some sins reach all the way to the sea. They say if you stand beside the River Thames during the third hour of the night and listen closely, not with your ears, but with whatever part of you still believes in ghosts, you will hear someone calling your name from beneath the surface, softly, almost kindly, like a woman buried, but not allowed to die. These are the women history didn't just punish it, buried them. Alive, conscious, bound with both body and soul, locked into punishments, designed not just to silence them, but to make them vanish from memory. These were not women who were caught stealing bread or lying with men. These were women who defied the order of empires, and in return they were not executed. They were erased during the so-called Golden Age of piracy, from the late 1600s through the early 1700s. It was believed that the sea belonged to men, and that any woman who stepped aboard a ship with intent in her eyes and command in her voice was not only a criminal but a betrayal of natural law. British Admiralty courts declared openly that women pirates were not merely criminals, they were blasphemies, they were monsters against creation, and so ordinary death was too merciful for them. Instead, they were made into warnings, made into curses, made into myths that would not be believed. This is not legend. This is archive, and in this story, every scream is real. We begin with Lucy Carnell, the one they called the blood-drinking pirate, captured in 1712 off the coast of Cornwall. Her trial was not legal, it was theatrical. The judge entered the courtroom already, shaking not with fear but with rage, and said, "This is not a woman, this is terror itself." Lucy stood silent throughout the entire proceeding. She did not plead, she did not beg. Her eyes were steady, fixed on the flame of the single oil lamp in the corner. When the sentence was read, it was not hanging. It was immolation, to be burned alive at midnight under the full moon, so that heaven and hell both could bear witness. They tied her inverted in an iron harness above a pyre, soaked the pyre wood in whale oil, and waited for the bell to strike 12. When the fire reached her skin, she did not scream, but when it reached her ribs, she said, "I am not ending, I am returning with fire." And that night the air itself recoiled. The priests vomited as they recited the scripture, and the townspeople watched in silence as the flame turned blue and stayed blue until her body was ash. Her remains were dumped into the river, and from that day forward the local fishermen refused to cast nets there because they said the water began whispering back. No birds returned to that part of the bank for over 70 years, and even now, satellite imaging shows that stretch of the river reflects no moonlight. But the most terrifying part of all is that Lucy's last words match a phrase carved under the altar of a ruined chapel in Ireland, hundreds of miles away. "I will return with fire," dated 1632. This was not the first time someone tried to end her and failed, and it would not be the last. Her story was not the story of a pirate, it was the story of a reckoning. And if you feel a sensation in your chest right now, a heat, a pressure, like something ancient, recognizing something inside you, do not turn away, because this story is not being told to you, it is being told through you. Her memory survives in the parts of you that have not yet been colonized by obedience. This is how it begins, not with justice, not with punishment, but with the lie that she ever deserved either. The laugh that shook the court. It starts with a laugh, not the kind that brings joy, but the kind that shakes the structure of everything men have built, a sound that did not belong in a courtroom made for silence. It was the year 1719. The colonial city of Port Royal had not yet recovered from the quake that half drowned it, but the empire continued to stretch its laws into every wet corner of the world, and today the law had a woman in its mouth. Her name was Emma Duval, and what she did was simple. She wore a man's coat, sailed a stolen sloop, and killed 3 merchants in open water, not with guns but with poison, the kind brewed in small batches with crushed root and blood, and when she was dragged into court, bound in salt-drenched ropes. The judges thought she would be broken, they thought her neck would tremble or her voice would crack, but instead, when they read the charges aloud, she laughed, a breathless cold sound, like someone remembering that Fear was never real to begin with, and the moment that sound reached the ceiling, every man in that chamber shifted in his seat because they saw something in her eyes. They couldn't sentence something that knew them too well. Emma said nothing, but held her head high, while the priest refused to bless her presence, and the guards avoided her shadow. Her silence wasn't submission, it was control, and for that silence they sentenced her to be erased, not killed, not jailed, but made into an example. Moment it is, because something once buried has begun to float inside you. This is not folklore. This is not metaphor. This is what power does. When it panics, it tries to tear the truth apart piece by piece. But Emma's silence was not torn, it was planted, and now you are standing near its root, and the longer you listen, the deeper it grows. She wrote what she was forbidden to say. It was not fire or rope or blade that silenced her. It was paper-thick parchment soaked in oil and rule, ink spread by the hand of men who wrote laws not to protect, but to erase. The year was 1733, and the city of Ghent stood at the crossroads of power, where the Holy Roman Empire tangled its banners with the dying breath of Spanish dominion, and somewhere inside the stone corridors of a Jesuit tribunal, a woman was dragged by her wrists, not for witchcraft, not for theft, but for writing words she was never authorized to know. Her name was Maria Black, not born of nobility but fluent in the language of maps and margins, a woman who never raised a weapon but who wrote with such precision that her notes could collapse a fortress or split a political alliance. And that is exactly what they claim she did. She was found with a folded letter hidden in her sleeve, sealed with wax but blank, until it was held to flame, where verses from the Book of Seven tone verse A. Revelations twisted into navigation coordinates and naval instructions in cipher they had never seen before, one bishop said. Her handwriting looked like it breathed when she moved the ink bent around her will, and when they placed the revelations in cipher there, a bishop they had never seen before. Parchment in holy water, it refused to dissolve her trial. Was not a matter of guilt, it was a matter of memory. They asked who taught her. She did not answer. They asked who she served. She closed her eyes. They asked who gave her the authority to write. She opened her mouth and said, "I do not ask permission," and that was the last sentence she would ever speak. The punishment was not execution, but an act of cleansing. She was taken to a vaulted room below the monastery, where the walls were lined with the torn bindings of banned books. And in that room they took her tongue, not with the precision of a surgeon, but with the brutality of a warning. They did not sever it all at once. They cut it piece by piece each time, asking but her to confess as the blood poured down her chest. And still she did not cry out. Only when the final slice came did she open her mouth wide and spit blood directly onto the floor, tracing a shape no one had seen before. 5 interlocking lines. A pattern now banned in all Belgian religious texts. 3 days later, 3 of the monks involved in the ritual were found dead in their cells, not by wound or poison, but with their throats collapsed inward as if silenced by something. Far larger than air carved into the stone above their beds was that same 5-line symbol etched so deep it could not be sanded out. The church sealed the room, declared it cursed, and locked its doors with 7 iron keys. But the stain on the floor never dried, and every few years another monk would report hearing writing in the walls, soft scratching at night like quills dragged across skin, and when asked what they heard, they all described the same thing, the sound of someone spelling their name backwards. The documents say Maria died weeks later from blood loss and infection, but letters discovered in 1948 hidden behind an altar wall suggest she survived, smuggled out by 2 heretical scholars who preserved her journals in wax-sealed jars. Those journals, now scattered across Europe, speak of a belief that the written word, when stolen by the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. When returned to the rightful ones, becomes a doorway. Maria believed the alphabet itself had been corrupted, not by accident, but by design, and that certain letters had once carried power before empire carved them into obedience. She said the first word ever spoken by man was not love or light, it was command. And she wanted that sound back. If you feel your throat tighten as you listen, if your mouth dries without warning, or if the name you've always called yourself feels wrong on your tongue, it is not coincidence. It is the echo of a woman who had her voice taken but not her message. She is still writing through those who dare to remember how dangerous a single word can be. And now that word is in you, buried alive in the brick that still listens. They said she vanished, but that was never true. She was buried in plain sight inside the limestone skeleton of a prison that no longer appears on maps, though its foundation still breathes through the cellar walls of what is now a wine cellar in Bordeaux. The year was 1756. Louis XV reigned over France, and across the countryside, women were being captured, not for crimes but for presence. Women who refused, arranged silence, who questioned curfews, who lingered in places meant only for passing through. One of them was Celeste Arnaud. She was born beneath the bell tower of Saint Michel, where her mother cleaned the blood off pews after execution, and her father disappeared before she ever spoke a word. She grew up between sermons and shadows, speaking only when necessary, reading everything they said she mustn't, and at the age of 20 she led something that has been called many names: an uprising, a gathering, a sin, a night of heresy. In truth, it was 6 women gathered inside a crypt, sharing bread, wine, and secrets they had memorized from the diaries of dead nuns, diaries that spoke of rituals erased by canon law, of ways women once communed with God directly, without priests, without permission. Someone betrayed them, and the guards came not with orders but with rope. Their punishment was immediate: public branding of the throat with a heated cross meant to bear silence and shame. Celeste, however, did not scream. Her lips moved without sound, mouthing something again and again, even as the flesh blistered beneath iron. And when they brought her to trial, she did not defend herself. She asked a question: "Who will speak when you have finished burning us?" And no one answered. She was declared unfit for execution, and instead sentenced to live forever in a space designed for forgetting. She was placed in the bowels of Fort Medoc, in a cell without locks, because they sealed it from the outside with stone. They walled her in with 3 candles, 1 loaf of bread, and no hope for return. The prison records list her as deceased within 4 days, but a stonemason's private journal from the year 1782 tells another story. During a renovation of the fort's drainage tunnels, he heard weeping and found a sealed cavity behind a false wall. Inside was a chair, a chain, a basin, and 3 words carved hundreds of times into every donning: surface. Je me souviens, I remember, but no bones, no clothing, no body, just those words scratched over and over, as if a single sentence could keep something breathing when all else was gone. The mason reported his discovery and was dead within. A week struck down by a fever. No one else caught. When his apprentice went to recover the markings, the wall had been resealed and the corridor collapsed from above. There is reason to believe Celeste never died, or if she did, she found a way to embed herself into the stone itself, a presence that cannot be exorcised, only ignored. And even then, not for long. Over the last 50 years, multiple tenants who now live above those buried foundations have complained of nightmares of a woman tapping behind the cellar bricks, of voices that speak French in reverse, and of black wine that sours before the bottle is opened. A historian researching feminine punishment in pre-revolution France claimed to have found a parchment fragment near that site. It read, "We gave them our voices, and they buried them in brick." Now the brick is listening, and if you have ever heard stone settle in your house at night and thought it sounded like breath, it may not be imagination. Celeste is no longer sealed because the wall is gone, but she is not gone. And those who hear her do not just remember, they carry her forward into each conversation, each refusal, each moment they speak without permission. If you are still listening, your voice is no longer entirely your own. The child who killed with silence. They say she was too young to hate, but hate was never the word they feared the most. It was silence. And in 1772, in the moss-covered hills outside Edinburgh, that silence took the shape of a girl barely 13, whose eyes had already seen more than most men at war. Her name was Isla Ruthven, born to a scullery maid in a noble house that held its secrets in wine barrels and locked attics, where screams were drowned in chamber music. The Earl of Dunlock was a patron of art, but also a collector of children. And when Isla stopped speaking one morning, her mother begged the church to intervene. The priest came and watched her sit for hours, unmoving lips, sealed eyes fixed on the stone floor, and when he asked her what she had seen, she finally spoke, just 3 words: "He feeds darkness." The priest told the earl what was said, and within the day Isla was accused of poisoning the manor's air. Her mother vanished that night, and Isla was taken under order of the Scottish Court of Session, not to prison, but to the care of St. Bridget's House for Wayward Youth, a building that no longer exists, not because of decay, but because of the fire that would follow what happened inside its walls. Has been pieced together from burned parish records and the final letter of a nun named Sister Margrethe, who confessed before dying of plague that they never broke Isla. They tried everything: isolation, darkness, starvation, even exorcism, but she would not cry, would not beg, would not speak again. They feared her silence the way men fear prophecy, so they gave her a punishment that could not be recorded, only whispered. The girl was chained to the floor of the chapel, naked, knees on. Cold iron, her wrists bolted in such a way that she could only look down, not left, not right, only down and above her. A bronze crucifix with hollow eyes was mounted on the ceiling, leaking wax constantly onto her back. This was called purification through surrender, and it lasted 6 days. On the 7th, they found her smiling, not from madness, but from knowing she had survived what no one else could. The Mother Superior ordered her tongue cut and her eyes veiled. But before they could reach her, she whispered something into the stone, and the nun closest to her fell down, frothing blood. Isla was not a witch, not a weapon, not an angel. She was something older than all those names, something that spoke only when the earth was listening, and the ground beneath St. Bridget's listened well. A month later, the building burned from within, not by hands, not by storm, but by heat that rose from the basement. Up survivors described screams that came from under the floor, not above it. Isla's body was never found, just a chain link embedded in scorched stone and the smell of copper that has never left the site since. If you walk the ruins today, grass won't grow where she knelt and animals won't enter the threshold. A plaque on the wall says nothing about her, only that the building was once a place of grace, but the locals call it the House of the Still Tongue, and children born near the hill sometimes do not cry for the first 3 days, as if remembering something they were not supposed to inherit. If, as you listen, your throat tightens and you feel a presence behind your knees like something reaching up through the ground, that is not fear. That is what Isla became, not a ghost but a signal, a reminder that even a girl who says nothing can unmake the structures men die to protect. And if your silence now feels heavier than before, it's because she is. Inside it, nailed to the floor of God's house, there are places where prayers never rise, where the stone is soaked with things no scripture can cleanse. And in the year 1764, in the Bavarian town of Regensburg, one such church still stands, its bells long silenced, its pews empty, yet its floor remains warm, as if something beneath it still remembers her, the one they called a servant of confusion, not for casting spells or shedding blood, but for preaching with her hands. Her name was Theresia Marl. Her crime was standing barefoot on the altar of St. Oswald's Cathedral during evening mass and performing gestures that were later described as blasphemous, but witnesses could not agree on what she had done. Some said she traced an ancient star in the air. Others said she pulled something invisible from her chest and offered it to the statue of St. Peter. What all agreed on was this: the moment she moved, a wind passed through the cathedral despite every door being closed, and the candles reversed, their flames pointing downward. The bishop declared it heresy, and the townspeople demanded purification. But they did not burn her or hang her. They kept her alive and conscious. Because the punishment was to be witnessed, they dragged her to the front of the church and laid her down on the altar, her arms spread in the shape of a cross. And before the choir boys, before the congregation, before God, they drove long iron nails through the palms of her hands into the ancient oak boards. The nails were not clean. They were old, rusted, bent, reused from coffin lids. She did not scream, only bit her lip until the blood ran down her chin. Then they took smaller nails and fixed her ankles to the floor so that she could not shift or flinch or move, and when she blinked, the bishop dipped his fingers in holy water and flung it at her eyes, saying, "May this cleanse what you dared to see." She was left there for 3 nights, not fed, not clothed, exposed to the cold, stone air. While worship continued around her, the congregation was ordered to sing louder to drown out any sound she might make, but she never spoke, never cried, never begged. And on the 4th day, when they came to remove her, she was gone. Not escaped, not untied, just gone. The nails remained, buried in the floor, dark with dried blood, and the boards beneath them warped as if from fire. They said it was a trick, a conspiracy, a devil's ruse, but when the priests tried to resume Mass, the altar cracked from beneath and no repair since has held the floor in place. A letter discovered in a hidden compartment of the bishop's chambers, dated weeks later, confessed that Teresa had reappeared in his dreams night after night, standing in the church with blood running up her arms, not down her mouth full of dirt and her hands glowing. He wrote that her silence was louder than any sermon and that he could no longer speak without tasting iron. His letter ends with, "The words, I have nailed the divine to wood, and it has not forgiven me since then." The church was closed, not by decree but by decay. Every attempt to reclaim it has failed. Scaffolds collapse, lights shatter, birds refuse to enter, and even now, those who live nearby say that if you press your ear to the eastern wall, you hear nails being driven over and over, endlessly, as if her crucifixion never ended, but has become an eternal act, not of punishment, but of defiance. And if, as you listen now, your palms begin to ache, or you feel pressure where your heels meet the ground, that is not discomfort, that is alignment. Because Teresa did not die, she became the warning nailed into the foundation of faith itself. That when a woman speaks with her body and not her voice, even silence becomes rebellion, and rebellion must be buried in wood. She was fed to the rats alive. The worst prisons are not the ones with bars, they are the ones carved beneath cities where the earth swallows, screams, and the rot becomes scripture. In 1791, the Spanish Empire was collapsing under the weight of its colonies and corruption. But beneath the streets of Barcelona, they still kept a room for women who disobeyed, not with guns, not with curses, but with clarity. Her name was Magdalena Cordera, a midwife who refused to hand over the names of mothers who had born children in secret, hiding them from the church's records and the king's taxes. She was accused of aiding fugitives, but the truth was more disturbing. She had been keeping a log in her own handwriting detailing the names of every woman who died in childbirth, under forced ecclesiastical control, naming priests who demanded silence over life, and doctors who injected mercury into wombs to produce stillborns. Her ledger had no spells, no politics, only truth, and truth in that year was enough to sign your death warrant. But they did not kill her, not the way men are killed. They wanted to make a lesson of her, something that would ripple through the alleys and mouths of every poor girl with a secret inside her belly. They brought her not to trial but to the Subterraneo del Olvido, the underground of forgetting beneath the Sant Pere monastery, built over Roman ruins, where the walls still sweat with salt and iron. There was no cell, no light, no guards, just a tunnel and a hollowed-out cavity where no one came back from. Magdalena was chained by the neck to the center, post a shallow ditch dug around her body. She was stripped, naked, her hands tied behind her back, and a wet cloth stuffed into of her mouth, not to muffle screams, but to stop her from biting off her own tongue, because they knew what was coming. They had prepared it carefully for days before they had starved a nest of over 60 black rats captured from the sewer systems and conditioned them with flesh soaked in sugar and wine, and now they were released one by one into the trench. Her body became the banquet. What she endured cannot be documented, not fully. Only fragments survive in the hidden account of a monk who was forced to witness the procedure as penance for his own sins. He wrote that she shook for hours but never cried out, and that her eyes locked onto his, as if daring him to blink. First the rats began at her feet, chewing through tendon, then moved upwards slowly as her muscles seized and bled, and still her gaze never broke. Not even when they reached her abdomen. She died sometime before the dawn. not from blood loss, but from the shock of breath withheld for too long. The monk who watched her confessed the next morning and then tore out his own eyes with an iron rosary, and for that reason the full testimony was never allowed into the official archives. Magdalena's body was burned and the ashes, mixed with lime, then poured into a stream near the harbor. But to this day, fishermen refuse to cast nets near that water, and women who bathe their hands in it report the skin peeling away in tiny patches, as if chewed by invisible mouths. And there is something else. Those who have walked the tunnels beneath Saint-Père at night describe the sound of chewing, not loud but steady, not rodents, but something deeper, the sound of regret feasting endlessly on what the world tried to forget. If as you listen your skin itches or your arms feel exposed, it is because her suffering was never sealed. It was broadcast through soil and air and time, because pain that is silenced becomes contagious, and the silence they forced into Magdalena's throat now fills the mouths of every woman who is told to shut up and suffer. And if you have ever felt the fear of speaking your own truth, remember her, because she did not scream, and yet the rats still hear her. The woman hung from her hair for 9 days. Before they took her voice, they took her name. Before they took her name, they took her hair. And in 1704, under Queen Anne's trembling British reign, they found new ways to make an example out of a woman who would not kneel. Her name was whispered across the docks of Liverpool, not in reverence but in fear. They called her Annis Grey, a shipwright's daughter who walked among ropes and tar, and the language of men without apology. They said she had memorized the knots of every vessel that came through the port and could predict a storm by the silence of birds. But what sealed her fate was not what she knew it was, who she taught. Annis had gathered 7 other women, each from different households, daughters, wives, mistresses, and she taught them to repair sails, carve beams and read tide charts, skills forbidden by guild and church. And on the 6th week, one of the husbands found out and accused her of seduction through unnatural arts. The court never convened because the local priests took over. They declared her a contaminant, a root of inversion, and within 3 days she was dragged to the undercroft of St. Margaret's Chapel, a stone chamber where only men were allowed to confess. But that week they opened it to pain. Her sentence was handwritten by 3 bishops and nailed to the chapel door. She would be suspended by her own hair, not for minutes, not for hours, but until her spirit broke. They called it elevation of the shameful crown, a punishment so rare it had no precedent in English law. Her scalp was scrubbed with vinegar, then braided into a single thick cord, bound in animal glue, and threaded through a rusted iron hook mounted on the ceiling. Her arms were tied behind her, and her feet left dangling above wet stone. No food, no water, no prayer for 9 nights. She hung weight, tearing slowly at her scalp bone, pulling muscle blood, pooling below in silent circles. And yet she remained conscious, too stubborn to faint, too proud to beg. They said the only sound she made was breath, and even that was slow-measured, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of collapse. On the 9th night, when they returned, expecting a corpse, they found her smiling, her feet pointed, her eyes wide and red, but still alive. They panicked. They cut her down and locked her in the cellar, claiming she had been possessed by resistance. But the next morning, the priest who ordered her punishment was found hanging by his beard in the same room, hook still swaying, and the bishop above him had his tongue split down the middle like a serpent's, and carved into the wall behind them was no scripture, but a message scratched in dried blood: "Your kingdom split like hair." Annis was never seen again, not in body, not in bone. But every few years the chapel's floor cracks along the same fault line, and local children go bald overnight with no explanation. The hooks have been removed and the chamber bricked over, yet those who dig near its foundation still find strands of red-black braid buried deep in clay. And those strands will not rot, fire does not burn them, and water carries them back to shore, as if some part of her refuses to disintegrate. And if, as you listen, your scalp tightens or your hair feels heavier than it should, know that this is not nerves, this is resonance. Annis did not die. She elevated, and now every thread of hair that resists a comb, every knot that won't come loose is her whisper through The centuries telling you that some crowns are not made of gold but of blood, roots and survival, and when you feel yourself being pulled down by the weight of tradition, by the hands of those who say you don't belong on the mast or at the helm, remember this: there was once a woman who taught others to sail and was hanged by her hair, and she did not break, and neither will you. She stitched her own mouth shut. They called her possessed, but they were the ones who prayed louder. When the room went quiet, they said she was infected, but it was truth that burned through her veins, not disease. And in 1807, in the French village of Autun, during the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, where churches had become tools of state and whispers were punishable by ash, there lived a woman known only as Sister Delphine. Her surname erased from every parish record, but her legacy carved into the walls of the convent that caged her. She was not born holy. She was taken in as a child after her parents were condemned for harboring fugitives during the revolution, and she grew up learning to smile without moving her lips. The nuns said her silence was a blessing, but inside she memorized every cruelty she saw, every girl who vanished after confession, every bruise covered with wool, every cry muffled beneath the floorboards. Delphine wrote them all down at night on strips of linen torn from her own bedding, using a quill fashioned from a bird bone and ink made of ash oil and her own blood. She sewed the strips into the lining of her habit one by one, until she wore her resistance every day like a second skin. And when the new abbess came and instituted daily purity tests, where the girls were inspected like livestock, Delphine stood in the doorway and said nothing, just stared. And the next morning she was dragged from her cell, bound and thrown into isolation. But they made a mistake. They left her needle and thread, and when they returned 3 days later, she had sewn her own lips shut, not roughly, not with haste, but with surgical care. Black waxed thread passed precisely through 10 piercings, along her upper and lower lip, forming an X that held tight against every breath. The stitching curved inward, not outward, and when they tried to cut it, her jaw clenched so hard it cracked her molars. She was not screaming, she was becoming something else. And so they chained her arms to the wall and ordered fasting for the entire order, until she relented, thinking hunger would break her. But instead the youngest sisters began to faint in the chapel, overcome by visions. They claimed they saw the Virgin weeping black thread from her mouth, and that she whispered Delphine's name as the only prayer worth saying in panic. The abbess ordered the chapel sealed, and Delphine moved to the crypt where the air never warmed and the walls grew mold like breath. She was left there with a single candle and a crucifix carved from bone. And they say she began to write again, this time not with ink, but with her blood scraped from her gums and carved into the stone, a single phrase over and over: "You will not take my voice because I gave it away," when they opened the crypt. 3 weeks later, the walls were covered floor to ceiling in this sentence repeated endlessly, and Delphine's body sat perfectly upright against the wall, her lips still stitched, the thread not frayed, not broken, but now embedded into the skin like roots. She had written without speech, spoken without sound, and that terrified them more than any scream. She was buried without ceremony, her body walled into the crypt itself, but the girls she protected never forgot, and within 20 years the convent fell, abandoned, the bell cracked in half, and no orders ever returned. Today the ruins of Saint-Alarm are covered in ivy and rot, but those who walk near its broken altar say they sometimes hear breathing, not heavy, not angry, just present, as if something beneath the moss is waiting. And if you have ever felt the urge to bite your tongue when speaking truth, or sow your thoughts into silence, know this: Delphine did not lose her voice. She turned it into a weapon. And now that thread passes through time, needle to needle, breath to breath, and perhaps it is yours, now pulling at the corners of your lips, warning you that silence is not submission, it is preparation. The one who remembered too much. They said her memory was unnatural, too detailed, too perfect, too dangerous, and in 1719, during the reign of King George I, in the dark, fog-ridden corridors of Devon's Ashcombe Asylum, a place built not to heal but to hide, she was kept locked behind 3 iron doors, not because she was mad, but because she remembered every word ever spoken to her. Her name was Drusilla Fenn, and she had once served as a scribe for the Royal Inquisition tasked with recording confessions. In the language of the condemned, she learned to memorize entire hearings without ink and could recite them backwards weeks later. So when she began noticing patterns in the questions, contradictions in the trials, secret codes hidden in sentences spoken by clergy and nobility alike, she began stitching them together into something larger, an invisible web of coordinated manipulation, controlling the outcomes of trials. Long before they began, she reported this to the wrong person, and by morning she was declared mentally unfit for civic engagement and sent to Ashcombe, not for treatment, but for erasure. The asylum did not tolerate memory. They drugged her first, then starved her, then subjected her to a procedure called rotational forgetting, in which the patient was spun rapidly in a chair while being shouted at in multiple languages. The goal was to dislodge associations, but instead, Drusilla began to see more she claimed she could hear voices in. The echoes connecting stories across time. She began whispering fragments of trials that had been sealed for decades, naming names no one outside the highest chambers should know. And so the staff took her to room 9, the deepest chamber. No windows, no vents. The walls covered in pages torn from holy books pasted upside down to break symbolic structure. And in the center, a single chair bolted to the floor with a steel collar above it. They called it the forgetting seat, and for 10 nights she was kept inside, mouth gagged, ears stuffed, strapped in place, and fed only water laced with black poppy. But she did not forget. When they released her, she repeated every word she had heard while restrained, even the coughs, the footsteps, the casual cruelty between orderlies. And she added something new, the words behind, the words as if she could hear the intention, not just the sound. And when the lead doctor asked how she knew, she replied, "Your guilt breathes louder than your voice." The next day, the doctor hanged himself in the archive where Drusilla's transcripts were stored. His suicide note had only 2 words. She knew. Beneath the institution, panic spread, several staff vanished, and rumors of Drusilla's voice growing louder at night spread among the patients. She was taken again, this time not to room 9 but to the chapel, and there her punishment began. They did not kill her. They sealed her consciousness using a relic called the mirror box, an ancient monastic device rumored to trap awareness inside reflection. They placed her inside a coffin lined with mirrors, her own image, repeated 1,000 times, then closed the lid with 7 locks and buried it not in the cemetery but beneath the altar, so that every sermon would echo above her like a ritual suffocation. Her final words before the box closed were etched into the coffin's base. By the grave digger they read, "I remember what you forgot, and that is why I base to remain." To this day, the chapel stands but has no altar. It was removed after priests began reporting nightmares of their own face, screaming back at them now. Moss grows in a perfect rectangle where the altar once was, and visitors often report catching glimpses of themselves, blinking when they are not her. Story is almost gone, but not erased, because now it lives in you. And if you are still listening, if your skin has tensed and your breath caught at strange moments, I feel like you've read these words before, though you haven't. That is her reaching through reflection. And now I ask you, not as a narrator, but as a keeper of what they tried to burn. Comment below these exact words, not once but twice, so it binds to your memory. I did not forget. I was made to remember. Again, I did not forget. I was made to remember. This is not an algorithm. This is an echo, and by writing it you lock in what cannot be unseen. Drusilla remembered too much, and they buried her for it. But memory is not soil, it is fire, and fire spreads. The bride of the guillotine who wouldn't die. They called her the bride, not because she wore white, but because she met her fate with the serenity of a woman walking toward her own wedding. And in the year 1794, during the height of the French Revolution, under the screaming skies, of Paris, when the guillotine's shadow stretched longer than any church steeple. She was paraded through the crowd like an offering. Her name was Clairette Duval, and her crime was nothing written in law. It was the way she looked into the eyes of those who sentenced her, not with fear but recognition, as if she'd seen them all in another life on another scaffold. Clairette was a laundress by trade, but beneath her floorboards they found pages of poetry laced with forbidden names. Robespierre, Danton, Desmoulins, all dead or dying, and in her verses she spoke of blood that remembered of justice, that devoured itself, of queens reborn in the bodies of maids. The Committee of Public Safety declared her a mouthpiece of treason and ordered her to be made an example. The date set for her execution was the 13th of Thermidor, the same day. The sky bled orange, and the Seine turned black with ash from burning records when she stood on the platform. No one shouted, no one cheered. It was as if the crowd itself had lost language. Her dress was plain, her hands bound, but her lips moved silently as the blade was raised. She was praying not to God, but to memory. The executioner hesitated just a second. Too long. And she smiled, not with triumph, but with patience. The blade fell, and then stopped mid-air, halfway down its rail, held not by machinery, but by a force no one could see. The crowd gasped, and the air itself went still like a breath caught in the throat. The blade was reset and dropped again. It stopped again, and then a third time. Now the crowd was restless. Some said it was sabotage. Others divine intervention. The executioner fled, and Clairette was pulled from the platform, still breathing, still silent. The tribunal declared her bewitched and ordered a private beheading at night inside the cellars of the conciergerie, where no crowd could witness. But every time the blade was brought down, something. Shattered ropes, snapped metal, bent candles blew out. They tried to smother her, to starve her, to drown her, but nothing held her between this world and the next. And finally they locked her in the ossuary beneath the prison, a chamber of bones. So thick, the air itself tasted of dust and marrow. They tied her to a throne of femurs and placed a veil over her head, etched with the words, "She will not pass." The story should end there, but it did not. Weeks later, guards began reporting that the chamber door opened by itself, and that soft footsteps echoed upward through stone corridors. Prisoners claimed to see a woman in a bloodless gown walking past their cells without sound, without breath, but with eyes wide open, and the blade hovering just behind her, not falling, not rising, simply suspended. And soon after, revolutionaries began to die in their sleep, without wounds, without poison, just vanished like air pulled from lungs when they opened the ossuary again. Clairette's bindings were gone, and in the dust at her feet, a message was traced in bone dust. If you build a machine for forgetting, do not be surprised when it forgets how to die. Her body was never found, her records expunged yet. Every the 27th of July, the day her blade first froze, those who work at the Palais de Justice still report clocks, stopping mirrors fogging, and strange dreams of a woman in white who carries her own head beneath her arm as if offering it back to time. And if as you listen your pulse slows or your spine tightens, it is because you were never meant to see the machinery behind justice. You were meant to look away, but Clairette did not. And now she walks not for vengeance, but to remind them and us that even when the blade is sharp and the crowd hungry, death will hesitate for those who are already awake. They covered her in ash so she wouldn't rise. There are some women the earth refuses to keep buried, and in 1753 in the village of Llanlynnin, beneath the cold breath of northern Wales, they tried not once but 5 times to silence a girl whose only power was that she spoke to things no one else could see. Her name was Bethan Ellis. Born during a lunar eclipse to a family of gravediggers, her first word was not mother or father, but Hyriath, the Welsh word for longing so deep it has no cure. By the age of 8, she wandered nightly through the cemetery, claiming to speak with those who had not yet been named on any stone. When asked how she knew who would die, she simply pointed and said, "They're already waiting." It terrified the village and fascinated the clergy. So the vicar summoned her weekly for questioning, which turned to prayer, which turned to punishment. When she asked him why the angels around his bed were always crying, the church declared her a conduit for unclean spirits, and in the winter of that year, she was seized during a storm and taken to the peak of Moel Siabod, where ancient stones older than any Bible mark the graves of those condemned to be forgotten there. She was bound and left in a circle of salt. Stripped of clothing, hair-shaved ashes from the cremated poured over her head, not for warmth but as sealing, a ritual punishment once reserved for those thought to carry plague of the soul. Her hands were tied to stones, her legs buried in cold peat, and around her they built a ring of ash mixed with chalk and human teeth, believing the boundary would lock her spirit in her body. Should she die, but she did not die, not that night, nor the next. The shepherd who found her on the persistent fourth day wrote in his journal that she was humming not a song but a name over and over, a name no one had heard before but later matched to a drowned midwife from the next county. Over when the villagers came to retrieve her body, she stood up and walked toward them, dragging the stones still tied to her wrists. Her eyes were milky, her breath white, but her voice was clear. She said, "You buried me before I died. Now let me teach you how to grieve properly." They panicked, tried to bind her again, but she resisted, not with force but presence. The sheep fled, the air went still. The vicar who ordered her punishment collapsed, with blood leaking from his ears, and her family disowned her. That night she vanished into the woods carrying only a satchel of ashes and a string of teeth, and for 6 months every child born in the valley came out silent, not dead, not harmed, just quiet as if language itself had paused to listen. Stories say she returned only once. When her mother was dying, they say the earth opened slightly and her mother was swallowed without pain. No body, no burial, just gone. And since then no one has dared to step on the peak after snowfall, because even now footprints appear where none should. And at the base of the mountain there's a line of black soil that never grows grass. It's called the Ash Vein, and those who've tried to dig into it say it swallows shovels, breaks wrists and sings if you lie down close enough. Locals believe Bethan is not dead, just waiting beneath the crust of history, warmed by silence and fed by fear. If you feel a tightness in your chest now, it is not discomfort. It is the echo of being buried without consent, a sensation. Generations of women have passed down in blood and breath and teeth, and if ashes ever fall in your dreams, know this: they are not to cover, they are to seal. And some seals break with time, but others only break when remembered. So remember her, not as a witch, not as a victim, but as the one they feared would rise and speak what no one was supposed to know, that grief has a name, and sometimes it is still breathing. She carried the bones of 12 men. She arrived barefoot at the edge of New Orleans in 1812, the year the Mississippi choked on its own rain and the streets reeked of fever and rot. Her skin was pale and cracked from travel, her arms wrapped in cloth stained with something darker than blood, and around her neck a chain of bones no one could identify. They called her Marie Notte, not because that was her name, but because she never moved in daylight. She walked only at dusk when the lamps flickered and the shutters closed one by one, and wherever she passed, dogs howled and milk curdled. She took no room in any inn, no food from any hand, yet she never thinned. The preacher claimed she was a demon sent to seduce widowers, but when 3 men tried to follow her into the swamp, they were found 2 days later, drowned on dry land, their lungs filled with salt water, not river water, and their faces twisted in the shape of names. None of them bore. After that, the townspeople left her alone, but the children watched from attics as she entered the churchyard each night and dug small holes in the soil, perfectly spaced. Always 12, never more, never less, placing something inside each and whispering in a tongue older than the city itself. One night a boy followed her and said he saw her open the cloth around her arms and remove 12 human finger bones, each carved with a different letter, each wrapped in velvet and kissed before burial. When the town sheriff tried to stop her, she handed him a bone and said, "This was your father's, this is what you left behind." He never questioned her again. It was the doctor who uncovered the truth. In a moment of arrogance, he bribed a gravedigger to exhume one of the spots, and inside found not fingers but jawbones still wet, as if pulled recently. From flesh, every jaw had teeth removed precisely, and when they brought the bones to the priest, he turned white and dropped them onto the altar, saying they belonged to the 12 men who had presided over the old slave court, the one abolished a decade prior, after the massacre that burned half the quarter down, and whose records had been sealed by force. Now someone had remembered, and was stitching justice one bone at a time. They tried to arrest her, but her home could fist never be found. Her steps left, no prints, and by the time the mayor issued a decree for her removal, all 12 graves had bloomed wild roses despite no rain. That year, on the 13th night, Marie disappeared, and in her place lay a shallow pit at the center of the churchyard, filled with a perfect spiral of teeth arranged like a rosary of guilt, and next to them a note carved into slate. It read, "The mouth is where the lie begins. I have taken theirs, now speak yours." That morning, 12 widows in the town awoke screaming, each with the same dream of their dead husbands kneeling before Marie, teeth in hand, sobbing. And now when people walk by the cemetery at dusk, they avoid the north wall where roses still grow without soil, and where some say they see her shadow bending down again and again, as if planting bones into memory. And if your jaw tightens as you hear this, or your teeth ache for no reason, you may already be marked, because the justice she delivers does not fade. It waits, it listens, and when silence is no longer enough, it buries the truth in petals and bone, and calls it mercy. The choir girl who never blinked. They said she was touched by angels, but it wasn't heaven she sang for. And in 1798, during the Gothic decline of Vienna, when the empire's bones creaked beneath powdered wigs and hollow virtue, the Cathedral of St. Stephansdom housed a secret few dared to name a choir, assembled not for devotion but for obedience, a collection of orphaned girls trained in silence, shaped in harmony, and broken in ways that made their voices pure. They called them the Echo, daughters, and the youngest among them was Isolde, a girl with silver hair and eyes, the color of extinguished candles. She never spoke outside of song and never blinked. Not once, not in pain, not in sleep, not in the dim lantern light of Provence. Confession where priests watched for sin in pupils. They said she had been born during an eclipse, and that her mother died singing with her still inside, that she carried no shadow, and her breath never misted in winter. The choirmaster but believed she was divine. So he pushed her harder, kept her locked in the bell tower at night, forced her to sleep beneath the bells, so their tolling would shape her dreams. And when she began to sing notes, no one had ever written harmonies that bent time and made statues weep. The bishop declared her sacred, but others said something had begun to answer her when she sang, something that did not speak, but listened too intently. And late at night, beneath the cathedral stones, the rats fled the crypts and the walls grew warm, as if something inside them was waking soon. After Isolde's voice began changing, her tones layered with echoes that came before her, lips moved, her songs turned darker, ancient in cadence, and those who heard her alone reported hearing the sound of thousands humming behind her, and a weeping that seemed to come from inside their own skulls. When questioned, she remained silent, only blinking once after one priest demanded to know what she was channeling. That priest was found the next day, eyes wide, fingers snapped into the position of a conductor's pose, frozen in gesture, and on the wall behind him, written in candle soot, were the words, "You made her." An instrument now. Listen to what she plays. The choir was disbanded, the girls sent away, but Isolde was kept locked beneath the altar in a sealed chamber where music was forbidden and light never reached. But still her humming continued, echoing up through the prude. Cracks in the stone, filling the cathedral with dissonant lullabies that shook the crucifixes loose from their nails. Worshippers stopped coming, rats returned. And on the eve of the winter mass, the entire cathedral choir was found kneeling, a circle around the altar, mouths sewn shut with golden thread, each with a note in their palm written in wax. She never never blinked because she never stopped seeing the bishop, ordered the chamber beneath the altar sealed with molten lead, and declared her a myth. But builders who came decades later to renovate the foundation found the chamber perfectly preserved, and in the center still stood the wooden stool where she had once sat. And across the floor were thousands of small scratches forming perfect musical notation, but no instrument could play it because those who tried went mad, clawing at their ears until silence bled through the gaps. And now when tourists pass through St. Stephansdom, some say the air vibrates just slightly beneath the frescoes, as if something is humming behind the architecture, and occasionally a girl is born in Vienna who cannot blink, who sings lullabies no one taught her, and wakes, screaming at the sound of bells. If as you listen you feel the pressure behind your eyes or your ears pop without cause, it may be that some part of her melody has reached you, not in sound but in structure, because some songs are not meant to be heard, they are meant to be inherited, and she was not silence, she was memory conducted in flesh. So the next time you feel the air go still before a choir begins, or your reflection seems to hold its gaze a moment too long, remember this. There was once a girl who sang with the voices of the buried and never blinked because she saw everything, even what they tried to keep in the dark. The one whose heart kept beating after burial. They buried her twice, and still the heart would not stop, and in the year 1765, beneath the cold pine canopy of Vermont, when the colonies still bowed to the crown, and shadows stretched longer than laws, there lived a midwife named Eliza Harrow, known not for her kindness but for her precision. Her hands were steady as frost, her voice low and firm, and no child died under her care. Not once in 23 years they whispered that she whispered back to wombs that she could hear unborn hearts from rooms away, and that she spoke the names of infants before the mothers ever uttered them. But then the minister's wife died in childbirth, and Eliza was blamed, not by medicine, but by theology. The minister called her a serpent, and the governor of the province declared her a threat to providence. Her trial was not a trial, but a sermon read over her shackled body, as men stood in silent rows pretending justice was being done, and though no blade touched her skin, they sentenced her to living burial, a punishment whispered in ancient circles, reserved for those whose spirits were said to leak through their bodies. She was taken at dusk, wrapped in black linens, soaked in wine and herbs, and placed not in a coffin but in a wooden womb carved with scripture. Upside down, the townsfolk gathered in silence as she was lowered into a grave lined with salt and pine needles, her eyes open, her lips moving in prayer, not for life, but for memory. And as the final shovelful of earth fell, they say the sky cracked, not with thunder but with breath that night. Every child in the village woke screaming the same name, Eliza, Eliza, Eliza. And by morning her grave was warm, as if something beneath had begun to rise. 3 days later the soil split in a perfect ring, and the sound of a heartbeat echoed through the graveyard felt not heard, and when they exhumed her, what they found was not decay, but a body untouched. Skin flushed, lips parted, and between her ribs something pulsed. The local doctor swore her heart was beating independent of breath or brain, and when he cut it free, it continued to beat in his hand for 3 more days before turning black and splitting open, revealing 12 tiny teeth shaped like children's incisors. They buried her again, this time beneath stone and iron, but the soil would not harden, and every woman who gave birth within 5 miles heard Eliza's voice in their dreams, whispering, "Breathe, Pushy has your eyes." Even if they'd never spoken her name, decades passed and still the stories grew. The grave mossless, the stone cracked her name, worn away by something other than weather, and those who stood near it long enough reported feeling something shift in their chest, a rhythm not their own. In 1811, a cholera outbreak hit the region, and every child who survived had a strange birthmark over their ribs, the shape of a leaf, with veins like a heart. And now in the archives of Montpellier, there remains a single sealed box marked only with the letter E inside it, is a preserved human heart wrapped in pine needles, still faintly pulsing under glass. They say it can only be heard by women, and only during childbirth. And if you listen closely now, if your chest feels heavier, if you sense a second rhythm beneath your own, That is not fear, it is memory. It is Eliza Harrow, who was not a witch, not a healer, not a victim, but something they had no word for, and still don't, something that refuses to stop beating because her punishment was never silence. It was to remember every life she touched and carry those hearts within her own long after the breath was gone, because some midwives do not deliver children, they deliver time itself, and time does not stay buried. The girl who was chained to the clock tower. There are moments in time that were never meant to be counted, and in 1826, beneath the grey stone sky of Gloucestershire, England, when King George IV ruled with trembling fingers and every village kept its own secrets buried just beneath the parish records, a girl named Rosamund Pike was chained to the gears of a church clock, not because she had stolen or cursed or killed, but because she asked why time hurt women more than men. She was a foundling left at the church door on a Sunday morning in midwinter, wrapped in sheets, embroidered with a foreign language no one could read, raised by nuns but never baptized. Rosamund had the strange gift of knowing the exact hour of anything: birth, death, betrayal, loss. She would tell the priest as he passed, "Your father died at 4:17 this morning," and be correct. Her words were not guesses, they were precision. And by 15 she began carving numbers into her bed frame, moments before parishioners collapsed or storm bells rang or miscarriages began, and the church called her possessed and demanded her silence. But time does not silence itself, it breaks, and so she began interrupting Mass, reciting dates no one recognized, until one Sunday she stood before the congregation and screamed in the year 1850, "This church will burn and no one will save the bell." And her voice cracked the stained glass, not with volume but with pressure. The vicar declared her an abomination, said she was disturbing divine sequence, and ordered her confined to the bell tower, the tallest structure in the county, and there chained her wrists to the great iron cogs of the village clock, her body wrapped in linen soaked in oil, not for warmth but for humiliation. Each tick of the gear would stretch her arms a fraction further, until time itself would either break her or be broken. She was given no food, only communion wine, and no warmth, only breath from the rats that nested nearby, and still she did not scream. Instead she began to sing in precise rhythm to the ticking of the clock, a melody that grew darker with each hour until the nuns below began having seizures at vespers, and the clock itself slowed, not from mechanical failure, but from resistance, like the hands of time were being pulled backward. On the seventh day, lightning struck the tower, not from above, but from within, a blue flash that shattered the bell and melted the gears. Her chains turned to dust, but her body remained frozen in place. Arms, outstretched eyes opened toward the cracked ceiling, her mouth parted as if still counting to something beyond language. They brought her down, thinking her dead, but her pulse continued, slow and precise. One beat every 60 seconds. A human clock, they called it. She would not eat, would not move, would not age, and so they sealed her in a crypt beneath the nave, surrounded by hourglasses filled with church ash, believing if time was sacred, her sentence must be eternal. Decades passed, and the villagers forgot her until one day in 1901, when Queen Victoria died and every clock in Gloucestershire stopped for precisely 1 hour, and when the church crypt was opened, the stone coffin was empty, save for a single message carved into the base in bone: "Time does not belong to men today." The bell tower stands, but the new clock face bears no numbers, only symbols, only wounds, and when it chimes, it is never on the hour, it is always just before or just after. And those who listen closely say they hear a girl breathing between the ticks, as if she is still hanging there, counting down, not to her own death but to yours. And if your watch has ever skipped, if your breath has caught at 4:17, if you've woken at the exact same minute, 3 nights in a row, it may be that you have been marked, not by fate, but by a girl they chained to the concept of time, and who is still waiting to finish her count and begin the collapse of every hour that ever broke a woman. The orphan who dug her way out of the orphanage walls. They said she was born under no sign, no star, no prayer, and in 1802, in a soot-darkened alley of Baltimore, just as Thomas Jefferson penned declarations across oceans and the War of 1812 smoldered just beyond the horizon. She was found wrapped in burlap beside a dead dog, her eyes already open. Her name was written in blood on her chest, not ink, not thread, just blood, one word, Marin, and from the moment she was brought to St. Eleanor's orphanage, they knew she was not like the others. She never cried, she never blinked. She sat silently beside the basement furnace and whispered to the bricks, not to ghosts, not to God, just the bricks. The nuns said she smelled like grave soil and that her fingernails grew too fast. And when she turned 8 and the headmistress began to disappear for hours each night, the other girls claimed they saw Marin digging with her hands, not into the earth but into the walls, as if the mortar obeyed her. And when some names the Gallows cannot keep, and in the year 1729, in a town now wiped from every map, but once known as Witherfield, Massachusetts, during the cold grip of winter and under the jurisdiction of Colonial Governor William Burnett, there lived a woman called Mercy, till a widow, midwife and maker of herbs, who knew the names of roots like others knew psalms. She was not feared because she killed, but because she healed, and those who paid silver were cured, while those who paid nothing still lived, and that frightened men in robes and men in court. So when a child of a wealthy merchant died from fever, and her name was whispered in blame, the church declared her unclean, and a trial was held without testimony. Only accusations repeated until they became scripture. The jury found her guilty of malice through unnatural means, and the sentence was death by hanging. They brought her to the town square on the 3rd of January, her hands bound with lambskin, her mouth gagged with rosemary, and when the rope snapped tight, she dropped but did not die. Her body twitched, but her eyes never dimmed. And when they cut her down, after the full minute of hanging, she stood and whispered, "The breath you stole returns." The judge panicked and demanded the hanging be done again, this time with new ropes soaked in ash and salt. The second time her neck cracked, but the sound was wrong, not of bone but of firewood breaking hollow, and when again she was cut down, she opened her mouth and 13 locusts flew out, each circling the magistrate's head without ever touching him. The townspeople, now terrified, tried a third time, binding her in iron before the drop, and this time burying her, afterward in consecrated ground. But that night, the soil where she lay bubbled and hissed, and by morning the grave was empty, her clothes folded neatly atop the stone, and a note pinned with a thorn. It read, "A noose cannot kill what you made." With fear, over the next month, every man who voted for her death lost something, not wealth, not health, but daughters. Each one vanished into fog, never screaming, never seen again, only the sound of ropes swinging above empty cradles, and though no bodies were found, their shoes were placed in perfect rows on the church steps, and Mercy's name began appearing scratched into mirrors, windows, and breath-fogged panes, even on the governor's carriage glass where it spelled "3rd times Mercy." Now it's yours. The town was abandoned by 1742. Its records sealed its name, erased, and only in the margins of old Puritan diaries do hints remain. One mentions a bell that rang at midnight for 7 days after her last hanging, and another claims that the church itself sank into the ground overnight, and that if you walk the woods outside Salem and feel the wind stop, suddenly you are close to Witherfield, where moss grows in rope patterns, and if you listen long enough you can hear the crack of a neck followed by breathing not stopped, but starting again and again. Some say Mercy was no witch, just a woman who refused to die properly, and others believe she was something older, born where fear meets injustice, and every time someone innocent is condemned, she comes a little closer, dragging that broken rope, whispering in the judge's voice the verdict meant for him. And if you've ever had a dream where you're falling but never hit the ground or wake, with the feeling that someone has unwrapped your hands in the night, you may already be marked, not by her wrath but by her breath, which never stopped, only waited. Because what hangs does not always die, and sometimes justice rises from the gallows, not to forgive, but to finish. The house that refused to forget her name. They said it was just a house, but it kept remembering, and in the year 1807, on the northern edge of Devonshire, England, where sea winds scraped skin like sin, and the moors held the silence of buried prayers, there stood a manor known as Greystone Hollow, a place once owned by Sir Alaric Vestry, a man whose wealth came from ships, whose cargo bore more chains than spices, and who built the house, not for living but for hiding his past beneath marble and velvet. The house was pronged, large but its foundation crooked, as if the soil beneath it had been disturbed too often, and they said it was cursed from the moment the final stone was laid, not because of what it held, but because of who had died in its making. Her name was Aldara, a servant girl brought from Barbados who spoke 5 languages and never screamed, not even when they took her tongue in the cellar for speaking truth to the mistress. She bled quietly, wrote letters with her wrists, and disappeared 3 weeks later, after being sealed alive inside the eastern wall of the house, with only her rosary and a child growing inside her. No one mourned her, no one remembered her, and yet the wall never dried the paint, peeled every season, and behind it a heartbeat echoed faintly like rain in a locked room. And when guests arrived to stay in the east wing, they woke with her name, carved into their skin, not with blades, but with breath, Aldara, over and over. Sometimes on their ribs, sometimes their lips, and one man was found hung in the wardrobe with rosary beads wrapped around his tongue. The Vestry family tried to sell the house, but every buyer lost their daughters to the cliffs, and one priest, who came to exorcise it, screamed her name 3 times before stabbing out his own eyes. By 1841, the manor was abandoned, but the eastern wall still stood untouched, and every time someone approached it, the floor would hum and nails would rise from the floorboards pointing north, as if pulled by memory, not magnetism. A scholar who stayed to study it wrote in his final letter, "This is not architecture, this is punishment given shape." The government sealed the house in 1860, declared it unfit for habitation, but still it breathed fog through its chimneys, and birds refused to nest within a mile of its shadow. And then in 1913, just before war broke across the continent, a girl was found weeping at the gate, saying her name was Aldara, though no such child had been born in the village for generations. She was taken in by the church and placed in the orphanage, where she refused to speak, but wrote constantly, covering the walls of her cell with architectural blueprints of Greystone Hollow matching its original design, despite claiming she had never seen it, and when questioned, she only wrote, "You cannot unbuild what you buried." The next morning, the orphanage burned to the ground with no fuel and no flame, just smoke that poured from the mouths of the children in silence. Now they say Greystone is gone, but no record shows demolition, no worker recalls its fall, and yet visitors to the moors sometimes find themselves beneath an unfamiliar sky, in front of a gate that should not be there, and a house that stands only in the corner of the eye but never in full focus, and always near it, the sound of beads tapping, stone and walls breathing. And if you dream of a door you cannot open or wake, with the taste of chalk on your tongue, it may be because the house has found you not to kill, but to witness, because Aldara was not vengeance, she was remembrance, pressed into the mortar of cruelty. And if you speak her name aloud once, you will never forget it, and the walls will start to lean toward you as if listening, and what they remember is not death but injustice, fossilized in wood and blood and silence, and what they want is not apology, but for you to carry her name into the places where they still deny she ever lived.